Thank you to participants who are joining us for this evening's live webinar, and welcome also to the teachers who are engaging with the recorded version. This is the first of 5 webinars hosted by MLTAV and supported by the Victorian Government, designed specifically to support languages teachers in the current remote teaching and learning environment and beyond. Our presenter for this webinar is Megan McLaughlin. You will have read Megan's bio and making the decision to participate. However, just briefly, Megan is an experienced teacher of Japanese who has taught students from prep to university. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Megan to present on the topic Approaches to Languages Assessment Online. Thanks, Megan. Over to you.
I'm hoping also that you can see my screen and I can see most of it, so hopefully enough of it to read reasonably well. But I was asked to particularly consider assessment in the online environment, and that's essentially the basis on which I've put this together, but I'm going to make some much more general comments as well. I guess to start with, I just want to make a few comments about assessment and what I come to as my own personal kind of passions around assessment, so that you understand where I'm coming from, and that helps you, I think, to interpret comments that I might make. I very much am interested in assessment as an opportunity, that any opportunity that we have to collect evidence of our students' learning and achievement. And I think that the current online environment, that's very different in different settings, I realise, offers some really great opportunities. Obviously, we all know it has the scariness and it has the uncertainty, and it's a bit like being a first year art teacher in their first lesson all over again, even 35 years down the track. But at the same time, I think there's lots of opportunity that if we focus on the whole, thing's much more positive. For me, assessment isn't just about test results. It's really much more importantly to me about monitoring where students are at, trying to understand what things they're finding easy, what things they're finding more difficult, thinking about ways that we might respond to help them move forward. I guess I have to mention the VCE space, which is a really complex one at the moment, and there's been all sorts of conversations that I've heard in various settings about authentication, about formative SACs is what we're doing at Melbourne Grammar School, about adjustment to the requirements, and last Friday the VCAA published updated study designs, and there's, I'm sure, going to be quite some discussion about that as well. There's been lots of stuff about reassurance of Year 12s. There's been lots of conversation about validation of what we do. And I'm sure that those conversations have both differences and similarities in different schools and from different hours of different days, in fact, and I think that's likely to continue. At the VCE assessment level for us at Melbourne Grammar School, the school approach at the moment is that we are only to conduct SACs during this period of isolation as formative tasks, and they will only be assessed S or N, but will be accompanied by written advice to students about how they could possibly improve in those assessment tasks. And now that my screen doesn't want to go, here we go. The other thing that my school is very much talking about is synchronous and asynchronous have been the two buzzwords for us that I think I've more or less got my head around now. And essentially, I think synchronous teaching and learning is everybody working on the same task at the same time, and usually with the teacher engaged with the students. Where asynchronous teaching is more a matter of tasks being set for students to work through at their own pace, either individually or in small groups, and without sort of constant presence of a teacher. A teacher might dip in and out of some of that from time to time, but the focus is much more on students directing their own pace of learning. Personally, I teach Japanese at years 9, 10, 11 and 12, I have one class at each year level, and my year 9s are beginning students of Japanese and my 10s are in their second year of learning Japanese. So 2 of my classes don't have an enormous amount of language to work with yet. So partly for that reason, and partly just because I like to teach and I like to have contact with my students, I've chosen to remain with a synchronous model essentially, but also working with small groups, and I'll explain a little bit more as we go as to what I've been doing. We don't use Zoom at school. We use a platform called Webex, but works pretty much in the same way. And it has a lobby in a similar to the Zoom waiting room. And so I've made use of that function of Webex to conduct my small group activities so that I can start a class with all students logging into a Webex meeting so that I can mark the roll, that I can have a good look at them on the screen. We're asking them to start with their videos on, and trying to, so that we've got a visual check of how we think they're going. And I'm doing a little bit of work with them all together, and then I'll tend to put all but 3 or 4 students into the lobby, which is a bit tedious because I haven't found a way of doing them en masse. I've had to send them there one at a time, but they're definitely learning the sentence lobby ni ikimasu. And then I'll work with 3 or 4 students on conversation practice or oral practice of the new piece of grammar or sentence structure, whatever was for that lesson. And then I'll put those 3 or 4 kids back into the lobby and bring the next 4 into my meeting with me. While they're sitting in the lobby, they just have a blank screen, but I can still see a list of names to know that they're still there and they haven't nicked off to do whatever, and I can bring them in if I wish. I have found it a really, really helpful way to get to know particularly my year 9 and 10 students very much better and very much more quickly than I think I normally do in the classroom. Because when working in the small groups, the students are not being interrupted by other things going on in the classroom, and the students who need a bit more time are not being harassed by the ones who want to move on more quickly. And those that actually need to go back a step and sometimes have things laid out differently, then I've a number of occasions shared my screen so that we could actually just have a document on the screen that I add notes and subtract notes and work through to try and find a way to explain something to a student in the way that that student needs the explanation. And I've actually had probably more of those wonderful aha moments in the last couple of months working online, partly because they're less confident students or students who are in Japanese because they've already had a go of beginning other languages and decided they can't learn languages. So it's actually been a really positive experience for me. I, as a matter of course in teaching for almost all of my career, I think I have a tendency just to make notes to myself with a mark out of 5 as to how I think a student has managed a task, where 0 is they didn't open their mouth and 5 was couldn't possibly have been any better. And I tend to record that kind of a score as I teach, so that I've actually got a lot of recorded data that would go towards making a grade judgment for macro skills, which is how we summarise our assessment at years 9 and 10. So I've got a lot of incidental assessment going on, just as a matter of teaching, I suppose. I have done a formative SAC, Unit 3 SAC 1, so the role play to resolve an issue. We'd started practice before we moved to online at the end of last term, and I did a lot more practice with students in pairs and individually over the first couple of weeks of this term, and then assessed them on a Webex teleconference. I made an audio recording on my phone just as a voice memo with their permission, and so we started the recording by asking for their student number, and I read a statement asking permission to record, which the students verbally agreed to before we actually commenced the recording. We've got some really, really strict protocols in place at Melbourne Grammar about recording. We're not allowed to record Webex conferences. But as I'm sure most of you would find, trying to assess that role play SAC and also be a good role play participant yourself is a really difficult thing to do, and I much prefer to be able to record and go back and listen to the language afterwards. I found that really easy to do on Webex. I felt quite confident that the boys were role playing with me, that their eyes weren't tracking on notes on the screen. They weren't looking around to other resources in the room around them. I felt that they were engaged with me and role playing with me, and they performed more or less as I would have expected them to in normal circumstances. However, they will only be graded S and N as per our protocols. But those kinds of tasks at whatever year level, I think worked perfectly well online, particularly where you can see them and watch where their eyes are tracking and those sorts of things. I also did the oral outcome with my year 11s, which we'd also just started work on when the call came to go home. And they were presenting on a famous Japanese figure that they had chosen themselves and were doing research on. And again, I found that worked really well. I divided the class into 3 groups of 6. And so they presented to a group of 6. I felt that 18 online was just getting too hard to manage and too hard for them to stay engaged. And it was probably better use of their time to be able to get on with some other work that I'd set while I did group work with the 6 of them. But it was still a big enough group that they could ask questions of each other to fulfill that requirement in that outcome of sort of managing questions from the floor, so to speak. I found it much easier, I think, to control the environment than in a classroom. That if anyone was being a bit noisy, you can always mute their microphone. But actually finding that students' concentration was much better, and PowerPoints worked a bit better, because even those who tend to put too much text and have too much little text in their PowerPoints in a classroom was actually still quite legible on a screen in front of us. So those kinds of elements worked, I thought, possibly even better than usual. In terms of speaking practice, while I've been doing mostly things with me engaged directly with my students, I have a number of colleagues, at least one I think I saw floating through into this presentation, who are asking students to create videos and upload videos for assessment, so that either audio or video recordings. And I think that's another way, obviously, of encouraging a continued focus on communicative language skills and spoken language when we're at a distance from each other. Listening and viewing, I'm sort of putting the viewing in together. I kind of tending to work, I guess, with listening, viewing and reading variously combined. But there have been a few things that I think it's taken me a little while to get on board with how to manage listening. And there's been some unexpected hitches, I suppose, with listening. One of them is with the courses that the commercial courses that we're using for Japanese, having moved from audio CDs to online audio resources, means that the only way that I can play or that I've found anyway, that I can play the test recordings is actually live through my computer into the web meeting, which I was a bit anxious about, I think, when I first had a go and decided, what the heck, we'll give it a shot. And I told my 9s and 10s I wasn't sure quite how this would go, but this is what we were going to try. And I expected them to concentrate and behave well and do the right thing. And so what I did was to send them the question paper in advance of the class, with instructions to print it off and have it ready to go. And then when we got to the lesson, they had that in front of them, or if they didn't have printing facilities at home, which probably about 50% of them don't, they could have the test paper open on their computer screens, and they needed to write their answers on a piece of paper. And for both the listening test and in a slide or two's time, the reading and writing tests, I asked them to angle their camera so that I could actually see their workspace, that rather than necessarily seeing their faces, I could see their sheet of paper and what they were doing and what they were writing. I can see a bit of chat coming on the Zoom about the SAC stuff, and I can see comments about, was I talking about a practice sack or whatever. I'm not actually necessarily talking about a practice sack. I guess one of the things is how different schools are interpreting what they're going to do to meet VCAR requirements and what those VCAR requirements are going to be. And yes, Catherine, absolutely, normally we are meant to record the SAC as an audio, and that was my argument for getting permission at school to record it. So hopefully that's picked up a couple of those questions. My impression of watching my students working is that that they are just doing what I'm asking them to do. I didn't see any evidence of them looking at other things. I didn't see any evidence in their responses that they cheated. Some of them should have done a lot better if they had. And I think for a number of them, they've actually been better focused because all they could hear was the audio without any interruption from other students. I've also done some viewing type stuff by delivering short video clips in the same kind of way. And I found that really useful, but I guess one of the big challenges is, like I have at the moment, is when you are the one who, when you're sharing your screen, then what you can see of the teleconference in terms of the people and having any sort of visual of the people you're talking to and all those kinds of things are hugely restricted. And keeping track of questions the students might ask, or keeping track of students maybe putting their hands up, all that kind of stuff. I find that the biggest challenge, I suppose, is to actually see, you know, what's going on and being able to keep track of that. But it's worked well in essentially for listening and for viewing, to be able to deliver directly through my computer. For viewing, I've also made use asynchronistically, if that's the right adverb, which I think might be on the next screen, in that I've found some really good clips on the topics that I've happened to have been working on YouTube and on various other things, and so I've made those links available for students to look at in their own time and to respond to in different ways back through our LMS, which happens to be Canvas, which I know a number of you would also be using. In terms of the sort of asynchronous listening and viewing in particular, the course books my students have all got really good listening resources, and the students have an online log in through the publisher for accessing the listening tasks themselves. So most of the time I've allowed them to just do that as practice within the lesson time, but not while they're actually with me. So when they're in the lobby getting on with the other set work, then that would include listening, and I think it's really important to keep that moving along. And the other thing I have finally got to use is a bit more with ClickView. I went to a PL session a few years ago on ClickView, looking at the way at making interactive things with video uploaded to ClickView. And I'm sure some of you will be way more skilled at this than me, but I'm really proud of my first few steps. And what I wanted to be able to do, both to provide a break for my Year 9 students, to build a bit more cultural content, I suppose, was to introduce them to, you know, a well-known anime. And I was tossing up initially between my neighbour Totoro and Ponyo, both of which we have in Japanese on DVD at school. However, at the moment, the only way I can find access to my neighbour Totoro through ClickView is to be able to use it in English, because it was shown free to air in Australia, and therefore it is able to be used within that ClickView platform. So that's the way that I've done it, which in many respects is not ideal. At the same time, the Studio Ghibli movies are now all on Netflix, and most of my students have access to Netflix. And I guess it's influenced the kinds of questions I've asked. So I've tried to ask questions about culture, and I've also asked some questions about do you know what these things are called in Japanese. So they might have needed to have done a bit of research to answer the question to be able to go on and see the next bit of the film. But I think on the whole it's been really useful, and it's been good to be able to introduce something a bit different for the students and to just break things up a bit, because I think they're getting very tired online, and very sort of starting to develop into a routine, but it's a routine that's still quite isolating and for a number of kids quite stressful. This is what the sort of ClickView analytics look like, and it's been really easy to make use of and really clean in its presentation, so that for the first little segment, I've just been giving them a sort of 10 or 15 minutes segments. So the first little segment, I asked some questions about what did they notice in the scene that seemed especially Japanese. Asked them about how many traditional features of a Japanese house they'd seen and could they name any in Japanese, those kinds of things. And so when you go to the analytics tab in your workspace against the video you've used, you get these kinds of graphs, and you can see the questions came up, and I've just browned out the student names, but you can see whether they've had 1 or 2 attempts. The scores are not, there was only one question that ClickView could score that was a true or false. All the rest were ones that I needed to mark, and I didn't bother to enter the scores back into ClickView. I will report to the kids differently. And if you click on one of those questions, you then actually get to see exactly what the students actually wrote in answer to their question. So I went through and did my little 5-point grading of, you know, how much information had they found, and how much did they appear to have actually thought about what I was asking, or did they just gloss over it and get on with it? And so I will certainly come back and use that a bit more in the future, and also use it with some other video that is in Japanese and some pieces that I've got as well. You can upload your own video to ClickView, and I've got a little clip that I took on a train in somewhere between Osaka and Kansai Airport, just recording, looking out the window, but it hears all the station announcements and things like that. And so I'm planning to move towards using that. Maybe not before we get back to school, but we'll see how we go. I think there are lots of other opportunities for both setting tasks to develop listening skills and also capturing evidence of their learning in a variety of different ways. And some of the ones that I haven't used yet, but some of them I've used in the past, I'm sure some of you will have used some, if not all of them, is asking students to make video clips themselves about particular topics. The Education Perfect units, not so much the vocab drilling, but the units that Education Perfect's been writing and putting up. There's some really great stuff there now that many of us have access to. In Japanese, you can still access Erin's challenge lessons, which have little video clips and well supported with language support, as well as ClickView, and 1,001 other ideas that I'm sure that you can ask each other. And I think I just saw someone saying that they didn't know you could put questions. The good thing about putting questions in ClickView is once you insert a question in ClickView, the student has to answer it before the video will proceed. So they can't gloss over it and decide they might answer it later. They actually have to respond to the question before they can keep watching. This is just a reminder to me, as well as everybody else that might have Education Perfect access. They've got a unit up at the moment in Japanese on the coronavirus itself. There's all sorts of different topics and across a whole range of languages. So not a paid ad at all for Education Perfect, but just a reminder that it's yet another resource that's there and trying to meet our needs. For reading and writing, I don't think that I've been teaching or assessing it particularly differently online than the way that I would have in the classroom anyway. I have a number of colleagues who've been making videos, introducing topics and concepts and explaining them and talking students through them. I haven't done that. Partly, I think, with my year 9 and 10 classes, there's not a lot to explain. I feel like they need more of the practice and less of the explanation anyway. And I think that the course books that I'm currently using are actually really good and clear in their explanations. And part of it is just I like the real-time engagement with my students, and I like to be able to respond individually to each student. So I haven't gone the instructional video route, but certainly it's being used in a range of subjects at school, and certainly students in my tutor group have been saying in particular subjects they're finding it very useful.
Megan, there's just one
Yep.
question there from Yingji about how to get into ClickView. I'm not sure if you've seen that.
ClickView, I think your school, you can Google it and go to the website, but I don't know whether you can subscribe as an individual or whether your school needs to have subscribed. I met it first of all at MLC, and then we have it at Melbourne Grammar, and I don't know how the actual network is quite wide, but I think it might boil down to a school software, and I would guess for most places it's go and talk to your librarian, because it's used quite widely, particularly in history at Melbourne Grammar, probably more than we would use it in languages. I hope that I haven't missed any others. I'll keep. In terms of kind of my teaching of the reading and writing, I've started each of my classes, and this has evolved a little bit over the, whatever we've had 5 or 6 weeks of teaching online now. Initially, I was just loading everything up onto Canvas, and it was taking me forever, and I wasn't happy with the presentation, and I was using lots of little text headers to try and put instructions in, and it just looked messy, and I found it hard to go back to. Students seem to follow through okay if they actually bothered to read the instructions. But I actually found that I was more comfortable working to a PowerPoint and then uploading that PowerPoint and then just putting up the other resources that they would need to execute what was described in the PowerPoint. And I'm finding that a bit more time efficient. I'm probably getting a bit faster at it as I get more used to it as well, I suppose. So that this is probably going to come a little bit out of order. I'll go the order that I put my PowerPoint together, and we'll come back to a quick look at the end, I think, as to exactly how I put that up, and hopefully that makes sense. I'm sorry if it's a bit out of order. In terms of reading and writing testing, so back on that assessment focus, I've run now both Year 9 and Year 10 unit tests. And I did them in the same way as I described for the listening. I made the paper available to them prior to the lesson, and you can see the example of my, I sent them an announcement on Canvas to say, please print off a copy of the attached test paper before tomorrow's lesson and put it with your Japanese things, but do not read it. I don't know whether they did or they didn't, but that was my instruction. And if you're planning to spend some time on Japanese between now and our lesson tomorrow, it should be spent on completing any outstanding work and vocabulary revision, not getting an early start on the test, which must be blank at the start of the class. So I asked them not to start on it early. I told them that I was going to check that the paper on their desk was blank before we started. And I kind of, the bottom line for me personally, which I'm sure people would disagree with me about, is if they did do a bit of cheating, they did a bit of research, they did a bit of a practice, and were either copying or had memorized answers on the test, my gut feeling is the students that might feel they needed to do that are actually the ones who mostly are not working particularly well. And if that meant they suddenly did a big burst of work and actually could do a few things, then it's probably a win anyway. I did ask them if they didn't have a way to print at home to email me. Mostly they didn't email me, but at the start of the class I checked, and I just marked on my roll who was therefore going to be looking up and down to their computer screen to see the paper. And it seemed to work fine. The test results look like I'd expect. The mistakes are as I would expect, and the only mistakes that are noticeably absent are the really weird mistakes from the same 2 kids sitting next to each other. Students then submitted their tests either if they've got scanning facilities at home or they've managed to successfully download one of the PDF scan apps onto their phones. They've uploaded as a PDF, or else they've just taken a photo of it, put the photo in a Word document and uploaded a Word document to Canvas. And I actually, with my 9s and 10s made sure that I could see their document on Canvas before I allowed them to log out of the class. I've made a lot of use of self-correction, and much more than I've ever done in the classroom. And I'm still not sure how successful or useful this has been. I'm still trying to work on ways to check up on it a little bit. But I have been asking students to work through workbook exercises. In my situation, I use Obento Deluxe with my 9s, Obento Supreme with my 10s, and Wakata with the 11s and 12s. So I've been posting exercises to be completed out of their workbooks and giving them the answer sheets for those and asking them to correct their own work. And I've set up a discussion board on Canvas where they can theoretically post questions, or they can email me, or they can speak to me in class. They're not posting questions on the whole at all. I don't know whether I think they're having trouble or not. And I've said just today to a couple of classes that I'm actually going to ask for, I'm going to individually ask students to send me a photograph of particular pages of their workbook in class over the next week so that I can see, without them having time to prepare, what's actually in their workbooks. I've also told my 9s that I might at any stage in small conversation class just ask them to hold their workbooks up to their cameras so that I can see what's being done. So I haven't quite got to that yet, but I feel like that's probably a bit of a gap there that I need to address. This is how I'm actually delivering, which is getting pretty much to the end of what I had prepared and hopefully some time for more questions. On Canvas, so I've been putting up work like this, changed a little bit recently, but essentially just I've created a module for each lesson. And so I would have the date and the period, etc. Some instruction just in a text header, some encouragement to be good language learners and to do something, not just learn your vocab, but here's some ideas about how. I've tried to make use of little video clips and things like that just to break it up and introduce topics and introduce a bit more breadth to their cultural understandings without making too much fuss about it. In this case, new characters and the workbooks that needed to be done and the grammar point that needed to be done, how to do it, etc. And then the answers for them to self-correct. More recently, I've evolved to this, which I find much easier to work with, that the first text header just tells them to open up the PowerPoint. I've just been putting the section of my PowerPoint as a PDF onto Canvas for them. And so the last screen might look something like this one from late last week. That their conversation practice would be about that and a bit of instruction, that there's a video I wanted them to go and have a look at, which is actually a screenshot of its front page in the corner there, without anything attached to it, just to enjoy watching the video and just to enjoy that cultural kind of component of presumably partly why they've chosen to do their language. Complete them, check their answers, and make sure they follow up with me if they have any questions. And then on Canvas, just the list of things they needed, so the workbook exercises. It looks like cover, write, check, vocab list for the season's vocab, etc. So that's the end of my PowerPoint and my current favourite 3 memes for surviving lockdown. And so I'm actually going to, I hope, share screen.
Megan, you're
caught behind mine and see what's going on it.
You're back. Your video had frozen, but you're back.
I'm back?
Yes.
Ah, okay. So when did it freeze? Too many messages.
Sorry, only just then. So no
okay.
problem at all.
I think it probably froze as I turned it, as I unshared.
Yeah.
Okay. So looking back through the questions from the bottom up, obviously a few people using OneNote. for students to complete their work across board 7 to 12. And interestingly, I've actually just moved to OneNote with my year. I've just created OneNote documents or workbooks, one each for my year 12 students to keep track of conversation practice notes and a whole lot of other stuff that I'm moving into that. Our Latin staff are also using OneNote quite extensively. So I'm having a play with that as well, and certainly people that are using it are finding it really a good way to I'm interested. So some schools looking to run exam. We've just had the announcement that we are not having exams at the end of this term, thankfully. But the SAC question is a really difficult one because different schools are obviously made the decisions and we need to do what our schools have decided. But there are really, really different answers in different places. I know of a school that are bringing their year 12s in to sit SAC supervised by non-teachers in some subjects at the moment even. Different schools are taking their own route, and it's just important to be doing what your school is doing and requiring you to do. The question about character languages, typing and handwriting, that's actually to some extent, I suppose, why I've done what I've done, is because I don't want them to be doing Japanese tests typed, and therefore they've either been printing off and handwriting onto their printed off exam paper, or they've been handwriting on a piece of paper and then scanning or photographing and uploading that back to me, so that I'm constantly seeing handwritten work. And I think that's really, really important. And it is a complication that is a little bit fiddly, unfortunately, but I think we just have to do it. Yeah, the sharing screens one's an interesting one too. And the suggestions about blurring backgrounds, putting in funky background pictures is a really good one. And again, it's absolutely going to be, to some extent, a socioeconomic issue as well that we need to be taking really seriously. I mean, I know that in terms of the resources my kids have at home, they're incredibly privileged. And yet we've still got some who don't have a great deal. And I actually now have students in my classes who are home in China, or who are home in, I've got 3 students home in Darwin. So I've got kids on different time zones. So the kids in China at the moment, if they've got a 9 o'clock class for Japanese, they're actually doing it at 7 a.m. And I've got kids who are working out of home where mum and dad are also working out of home. So to do conversation work, they have to walk out on the balcony and shut the door. So that it's, yeah, it's all of those lots of challenges. But certainly making us think. Do you have to take the view that this is refreshing and it's giving us a new lease on life and new skills. There's lots of conversation I see about ClickView and whether it's accessible for Department of Education teachers possibly through Edumail, so maybe to look into for department teachers. At the moment, I'm not seeing. I think at this point, I'd be really happy if someone wants to ask a question that they unmuted themselves and asked a question. Then I would feel less like I'm here all by myself with 89 of you apparently actually out there. If anyone has a question, they can put their hands up on the participant list. Well, Kerry, if nobody really does have a question, I will hand back.
I can see one just there from Catherine. Do you have to give grades at the end of the semester for years 7 to 9?
Okay, in my school, yes, we will give grades, I'm sure, at the end of semester for 7 to 9, and I would have no trouble at the moment grading my kids. Part of that's going to rest, I guess, on your school's policies around assessment and your own personal views around assessment, and the way in which your assessment procedures have been previously set up. For me, at Melbourne Grammar, and I mean, it's been different in different schools I've worked in, obviously. But for me at Melbourne Grammar, where as head of department, I get a fair say over how grades are put together and how they're put into the reporting system. For years 9 and 10, actually for 9 through to 12 Japanese, actually, we give a grade for regular vocabulary and script tests, just that routine check that you're actually doing this all of the time routinely and not falling through the cracks. We give a grade for oral, a grade for listening, a grade for reading, and a grade for writing, which viewing is probably not fully addressed yet, but I'm thinking I might actually move towards speaking, comprehension, and writing. And then what sits underneath that grade on a sort of A+ down to ungraded sort of scale would be, for me, a whole stack of tasks that I've assessed. So, you know, if I do a chapter test that has a listening part and a reading part and a writing part, I count those sections separately into each of those skills that are going to be reported on at the end of semester. And I would never have, I wouldn't have a task that is just a single task, so that I'm reporting on skills, not on happen to have a good day when you did that test, or, you know, happened to have a real slump for a week and did really poorly. I very much report a summary of smaller tasks, which I think give me a better picture of not only the actual standard at which that student is at the point at which I assess, but when I come to write reports, it gives me a much clearer picture of the progress of that student. It also makes it much quicker and easier to see where students have been going really well and then suddenly dropped away for some reason, and often you can find what that reason was for that drop off, and therefore it's easier to pick them back up again. So for me, assessment is ultimately about knowing my students and responding to their needs, and not about any kind of big stick. That's not to say I can't quite, you know, be quite hard-headed as a VCAR assessor of, you know, for VCAR assessing SACs and things, and do absolutely what needs to be done, but certainly lower down, that's the way that we assess.
Megan, Kerry Law had her hand up for a while.
Yep.
So Kerry, do you have a question?
Hi everyone. Sorry, I just typed it into the chat. I was actually
that's
asking,
fine.
Yeah, I want to know from Megan, when you got your student to use the OneNote, did you ask that student to use the 2016 version or the latest version? Because people keep telling me that it's a different version.
Might be interesting to hear a response from MLC on this one, who have been on the chat as well. I have only just come back to OneNote after a bit of an absence. I've not actually used it with students before. So for me, with my Year 12s at the moment, literally this week, this is my first foray into OneNote for a few years. And it's the first time I've actually used it as a shared document with students. I've used OneNote in the past to collect information, particularly to collect emails around students within my pastoral care group. And what I've discovered at the moment is I've got a whole stack of 2016-ish OneNote files that don't speak to the new OneNote, and I don't know how to retrieve them, and neither do I seem to still have a machine that will open them. So it seems to me like there's been a pretty major overhaul of OneNote, and actually there's some really big issues shifting from one to the other, but I know very little about it. So if anyone else would like to offer a comment on that. I got a thumbs up from somewhere, so maybe I got it right. Thank you.
And we've got Aisha. Would you like to ask a question? You've got your hand up.
Yes, please. I just had a question about, you mentioned publisher resources for like audio and video activities for the students. We seem to have a lack of those online resources for Indonesian. So what could you suggest for us to find some sort of those tasks for our students to do without having to create our own things and our own resources?
I really don't know for Indonesian what the answer is. If there are other Indonesian teachers in the meeting at the moment, I'd be very pleased to hear them contribute. My impression is that resourcing for Indonesian has not been great over the last 20 years, actually, ever since Indonesian started to really seem to struggle to maintain what had been a major growth in the 90s. I would assume that there would be some resources available if you did a good Google search through YouTube and those sorts of things, but maybe not tailored to kids. I don't know, actually, and which I'm embarrassed about, whether Indonesian has made it to Education Perfect or not, but they weren't initially. I wonder if there's anybody else that might have any more up-to-date internet information for Indonesian. Otherwise, I think I'd be out interviewing my Indonesian-speaking friends, whether or not they're actually Indonesian, and making little tiny videos just on a mobile phone that I can then use in the classroom, maybe even upload to ClickView and make use of in the classroom.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Megan.
Yep.
Can we able to load our own videos and all on a ClickView?
If you have access to ClickView, then you are able to upload videos that you have created. The only thing you have to be careful about in ClickView is that whatever you're uploading, that you have full copyright permission for.
Ah, right. Okay.
But if it's something that you took a video like and that sort of stuff, or that your kids have, or you've made a video yourself by interviewing somebody, then there shouldn't be a problem of uploading that to ClickView and then being able to use it, click on ClickView, or keeping it private.
No, is it if you are pick up from something from YouTube or something, and can we use it or still not?
It would depend what you would have to investigate the permissions available. And the way that I would personally do that in a school where ClickView is being used is see, is there someone in the library that actually normally takes on the responsibility for uploading new information or new things to ClickView? Like I would normally send an email to the library to say, I see this is coming up on free-to-air TV this week and I really want to be able to use it in Japanese. Would you please record it for me and put it on ClickView?
So we can't do it because we can't ask the VSL to do this one because I am teaching.
Well, you can always ask.
Okay. It's a long process when they are doing like that, isn't it?
Yeah, I would have, yeah, that's one for a few other people. Whoever is H. Holt Sawyer.
Hello, thank you
Hello.
so much for taking my question. Guten Abend.
Guten Abend, wie geht's?
Ja, danke, gut. I've got a question here about authenticating work that is done at home. So
Yeah.
we're talking about school-based assessments.
Yep.
Assuming we can't have 24 students on screen angling their cameras at a piece of paper, how would you best go about authenticating students' work? I've thought about this, and the thought was to ask them to fill in a cover sheet like we do at university. I authenticate, this is all my true work. And further thought, if we find that your level of language is not commensurate with what we're used to in class, it's suddenly far more sophisticated.
Yeah.
A teacher may ask you to explain the grammar that you've used, and if we're not satisfied that it's authentically yours, it might be null and void. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think up to about 20 students, maybe not 24, but certainly up to 20 you can supervise. I mean, that's how many I had in my Year 9 class, and I felt pretty confident that I was seeing what was going on with all of them. I think at the VCE level where that's where the questions are clearly going to arrive. I think all of those things that you say are all techniques that are really important to use. And I think, therefore, the more work we have seen and recorded in some form or another from our, particularly Unit 3-4 students, the better. Because I think ultimately, I mean, ultimately, I presume that BCAA is most likely to ask us for a statement of sort of verification that, given our knowledge of the students and given our knowledge of the students' work and given our interactions with those students, do we believe this to be the students' work? And I think most of us would think that we did or we didn't. And the sort of, I think, asking students to explain work that seems to be cut and pasted from somewhere or been written by a tutor or something like that. You know, we've always had those experiences and we have to hold the kids accountable. I'm interested that we've suddenly this week all been given access to one of the plagiarism software. It's been uploaded into our school system so that we can run any work through that. I don't know whether it's of any use in foreign language study or not. I haven't tried it out yet. But I'm wondering whether that's tied in with all of the sorts of authentication questions that you raise.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you. Somebody HZ coming up as a little purple box has a hand up. Somebody Zhao.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you can call me Helen. I'm a Chinese VCE teacher.
Yep.
Okay, I have a question. My class is mixed level class,
Yep.
which means I have year 11 and year 12.
Mm-hmm.
My year 11 is doing unit 1 and,
Yep.
Year 12 is in unit 3.
Mm-hmm.
We complete the outcome 3 last year. It's just because the subtopic we chose at that time is more suitable for doing that. So my question is, number 1, how can I manage the time for this mixed class for the SAC? Okay, number 2 is currently we can do both for the unit 3. We can go for role play, or we can go for reading, which is multi-modes text. Well, considering about the role play, I'm just thinking so many paralinguistics are inside, and then if we turn the video off, how can I do this?
I'll answer that question. I did the students, as we were doing the relay, we had our videos on.
Okay.
I didn't record with video on. That was why I recorded on my phone, because on my computer I had sound and video, so I could see the students and I could make judgments about their body language and all of that non-verbal communication stuff that we need to be keeping an eye on. But the only thing that I was allowed to record was the sound. So I just put my mobile phone on the desk next to me in flight mode so it couldn't suddenly ring or something. And I just recorded the sound, and it picked it up in really good quality for both my sound and theirs, and recorded. Probably also because I've not been teaching with a headset. I've just been teaching using my computer audio, because my office at home is quite quiet and my headset makes my ears get sore. So with my phone on the desk beside me, it was getting me just speaking and it was picking up the sound from the students over my computer. So that wasn't a problem, I don't think. I knew at the end of that whether I thought they'd managed that non-linguistic communication well or not. In terms of the different levels, I haven't had to do this for quite a while, but I would have thought that however you were managing that balance in the classroom wouldn't be very different to online. And in some ways, it might be easier online, both in terms of teaching and in terms of assessment, because you could effectively, within your timetable time, divide them into their classes and work with them in those smaller groups without them being noisy and interrupting each other. And in terms of assessment, I don't know why it would be very different a question.
So, can I just suggest something coming to my mind? I use like a breakout room.
Yeah.
maybe that's an idea because they are doing the different tasks for the different outcomes.
And so did both of those tasks involve audio input?
The unit ones, they are doing the writing.
Right.
Okay, so I'm thinking for the year 12s, we do the role play.
So those that are writing just need to be sitting in front of their computers with their computers angled so that you can see what's happening.
Yeah, I'm thinking to use the breakout room for those students.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing, it depends what system you're using. If you're using Zoom or you're using Webex.
Webex, we use Webex.
Okay, if you're using Webex Teams so that you can use breakout rooms that you can dip in and out of and see what's going on, that possibly works quite well. We're not using Teams, we're only using Meetings, which means I can put them in the lobby, but once they're in the lobby, I can't see them.
Yeah, that's
so I think that's
for me as well, because they said the students cannot use Teams from whatever the government now, they can only use Meetings.
Yeah, and then I guess if you've got a problem if during the same, then I think you'd have to schedule your SACs in different meetings.
Oh, okay. So different times.
So I think I would be doing one SAC in one lesson while the others did some other task that they didn't need me for. And I'd be doing the other SAC in the other lesson while the others were doing another task they didn't need me for.
I think I got it. Thank you. A very great idea.
Short
Thank
answer.
You. Thank you.
You're I don't think there are any other questions, and it's gone 6 o'clock, Kerry, so I'm hand back to you.
Thank you, Megan. We are very appreciative of you sharing your experience and expertise with us this afternoon. There's been a lot of messages coming through on the chat screen saying thank you, a really valuable session. So it's terrific. A recording of this webinar will be available via the MLTAV website tomorrow. I've copied a link. If you go back to the chat screen, I've actually copied a link to a brief online survey for, there it is. So if you sort of scroll up, you can copy it out of the chat screen. Actually, I'll put it in again so you don't have to scroll up. If you copy that out and at some point tonight or tomorrow, complete the brief survey, your feedback is really important for planning for future webinars, but it also gives me the information that I need to customize a certificate of participation for you for 1 hour PL time. So if you want to know anything about the other webinars in this suite, just go to our website on the homepage under What's New. Also, please feel free to call me at the MLTAV office at any time if you have any questions. So, Megan, that was fantastic. I think you deserve a cup of coffee.
I think I need dinner before church council meetings.
Oh, okay.
I'm in charge of in an hour or so.
So thank you. That was fantastic. I'll stop the recording